Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Reverend G. Here on WEMS Radio every Monday night from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I am Reverend Grenetta Mason, your host, aka Reverend G. And I'm here with a special guest, and we talk about spirituality, and we also talk about current events, and we talk about what's happening right now that impacts all of us. And we look at spirituality from a practical point of view because as we live, I hope that spirituality can become a part of our lives moment by moment, that it becomes something that we can use to support us throughout our days, throughout everything that we're going through. And we are going through some really, really trying times now, and a lot of things are happening, and so much information in so many ways that we have to take care of ourselves. So I hope that this show can give you some comfort, some ideas on how to support yourself now, and that we also have some fun, because I'm really about bringing the joy and living my best life with grace and ease. And I hope that I can share that with you and support you in living your best life. Tonight, I have a really, really, really special guest, and I'm so excited to have her here tonight. And we're going to get to some really great conversation. But I want to let you know that you can find me every day on Facebook as Reverend Grenetta Mason and on Instagram as Rev Grenetta. I'm also on YouTube. So you could get more inspiring information from me every single day. Tonight, my guest is Erica Martinez Gonzalez. And Erica is the director of Power for Puerto Rico. She's also a advocate for social justice and Latino issues. So I'm excited to have Erica here tonight so that we can share some time together and talk about what's going on in the world, how she's supporting. Hey, Erica.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Reverend G.
Yes, I'm excited to have you. It's nice to connect with you again. We spent so much time together at one point, right? And then now it's like, oh, Erica.
Bonding time, yes.
Yes.
Grateful for that.
So thank you for coming, Erica. And Power for Puerto Rico. I want you to tell us what that is and talk about your role and how you came to be the director of Power for Puerto Rico.
So Power for Puerto Rico is a national coalition that came together after Hurricane Maria hit. So we have national organizations like the Sierra Club, and then we have local Puerto Rican organizations. So we have Puerto Rican organizations that are based in Minnesota, Florida, Pennsylvania, and different areas. So we have our members, and then we have our network. But basically, after Hurricane Maria hit, there's a lot of regulations that govern Puerto Rico and get in the way of its well-being and also an emergency response. So it was recognized quickly that we needed to exert the pressure of organizations here on Washington to try to move stuff quickly. And then what happened is that the coalition started pivoting to structural issues that are embedded in laws, that are institutionalized, that have been governing Puerto Rico for many decades. So what we try to do as a coalition is exert the power of Puerto Rican constituents here, working with allies to build for change.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, what are some of your biggest challenges in doing that, Erica?
Right. Oh, and I realized I didn't answer the second question. So I got involved with Power for Puerto Rico as deputy director in April of 2018. And then I think about a year and a half later, became director. So as such, I help manage the vision and strategic planning of the coalition, and wear many hats because we're small but very committed team. So, we do stuff by consensus and have weekly meetings, and we work with the strengths of different partners. So we have members that are very, very excellent with leading social media campaigns, other folks that are good with advocating in DC, or, so we try to use everybody's strengths to working together to move the needle. So I'm sorry, your other question was the structural issues, right, affecting Puerto Rico. So
Yes.
I'll give you an example. So when the hurricane hit, it really, you had the natural disaster, and then you had with the man-made disaster. Well, the response, that was, everybody knows from the Trump administration, just the lack of preparation by FEMA. So there weren't even like adequate walkie-talkies on the ground for the hurricane that people knew were coming. So, communication, you had the longest blackout in US history, but the hurricane revealed a lot of the big problems that have existed for a long time prior to Trump coming into the office. So for example, there were trucks full of supplies from as close as the Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic is less than 200 miles from Puerto Rico. There were also supplies waiting in New Orleans. And you cannot, because of these shipping restrictions, you can only use a U.S. vessel, a U.S. ship, a ship that's made in the U.S. There's not a big shipping industry in the U.S. anymore. That happens abroad. It has to have the U.S. flag to be able to move from port to port. So that is an imposition only on Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and like 2 other jurisdictions. So first you had to get a waiver to move those supplies from as close as the Dominican Republic and New Orleans. And Trump issued a waiver for like just 10 days. So this is a part of the bureaucracy, but the deeper is that restriction, which also raises the price of goods going to Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico's, the average median income is lower than that of Mississippi's. So imagine coming in because of the shipping restrictions, that jacks up the prices of a lot of goods coming in, because it's added effort to get to Puerto Rico under those shipping restrictions. It's more costly rather. So Puerto Rican families wind up paying more for essential goods, considering that there's a lower income there. Now that law that's in place was put together in 1920 for supposedly for strategic military reasons. Now what it does, it benefits 2 shipping companies that have a monopoly. They have a duopoly. And so it just kind of benefits these 2 shippers, these 2 corporate shippers, basically. And then there's a lot of pushback also because it floats a small job economy, when studies have shown that if you get rid of this law, it will actually create more jobs. So it's one of these things that was like put in place to benefit the U.S. and U.S. corporations, but Puerto Rico the short end of the stick. So that's what I mean by like one of the many structural issues. But you can see, like what I'm saying, in an emergency situation, how that becomes life and death, because you should be able to supplies over from the Dominican Republic, someplace close in the Caribbean, you should be able to move.
Close. Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting, because you mentioned like a lot. It exposed some of the things that were going on prior to Trump. And now we've moved through 4 years of Trump, right? And here we are at a new space. What have you seen any shifts at all, or is it too soon to see anything that could impact the shift in how we're dealing with Puerto Rico?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there have been a number of good signals. So, for example, just today, I believe, or yesterday, the new secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Flood, she was a former congresswoman, and now she is the secretary of HUD. She just announced that some of the blocks that were put in place that were unfair in terms of the release of funding that have been congressionally approved to Puerto Rico, that some of those were released. So she's moving the money that had already been approved by Congress and that the Trump administration kept holding up. So what they were spreading, they were spreading a lot of lies saying that all this money was already in Puerto Rico when that wasn't the case. They were holding it up. And as a matter of fact, that's still under investigation about how the White House under Trump was interfering with not only funds to Puerto Rico, but also other funds that were designated. So her announcement was very welcomed, and she specifically said she wants to work with the island. Someone was appointed to oversee Puerto Rico affairs in the White House. So there have been a number of announcements that have been promising in terms of funding, et cetera. In terms of the bigger issues, like the status of Puerto Rico, the political status, because it is a colony. Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, and Guam are colonies in the same way that the British had colonies in India and Africa. And, you've had other empires that have had colonies. So Puerto Rico became a part of, but not a part of the United States through an act of war between Spain and the U.S. So it was traded off in the context of two basically superpowers fighting it out. And that remains an issue today, because what you have in Puerto Rico, as well as in Guam, as well as the U.S. Virgin Islands, you have people that were existing already there as their own people with their own culture, own language, traditions, way of being. And then you have like two giants fighting it out and dominating. And that still reverberates today. So.
Right, that's still happening today. Yeah, it's really interesting when you think of what you could do to support that and everything that you're doing to like move the needle, to like get things moving and moving forward. So it's great that you can see some things opening up, right, for support to kind of handle that. And as we know, it will take time, money, and just a lot of different things to get it Puerto Rico in the right place and moving it. Like that one issue you talked about is big, getting the food there, the price that the people pay, jobs. So it's a lot more to it.
Absolutely. You're talking about decades of a mess being built. So it's going to take time to resolve. But, there are a number of issues that Power for Puerto Rico works on, but one of the big ones, which has been a continuous issue, is the status of Puerto Rico. So we believe that Puerto Rico, like the other U.S. colonies, has the right to determine its own future without pressure from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. So really, 1898, the U.S. decides, even though there was already a war between rebels across different territories, different lands like Cuba and the Philippines that were fighting it out with Spain to change their conditions, the U.S. steps in. The U.S. and Spain negotiated directly instead of like people from these lands, these countries in formation being brought to the table as they should have been, because they were the ones that were fighting Spain up front. There were a lot of independence movements, a lot of movements to change conditions. So, at that point, Puerto Rico's ability to decipher itself was just completely overshadowed by Spain and the United States. Then in 1917, the U.S. decided, without consulting Puerto Rico, that it was going to make Puerto Rican citizens. It's made a number of decisions without even hearing or consulting people on the ground. So what we are saying that in 2021, when we're supposed to be evolving and reclaiming democracy and human rights, Puerto Ricans, as well as all the people of the other territories, should be able to determine how they want their country or place to look in the future.
Okay. All right. Okay. That's interesting. And what does that look like?
So, decolonization is been a process for a long time. The United Nations oversees it. What we are advocating for is a bill that was introduced by Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and it's called the Puerto Rico SelfDetermination Act, and that would create a constitutional assembly for Puerto Ricans to send delegates to the table and hash out all the status options, including what each would involve, what the transitional processes would look like. Because what the problem is that people people who support only one status, like for example, Puerto Rico becoming just a state, because there's a competing bill. What we are saying is that the Self-Determination Act that we support, that anything that involves Puerto Rico status has to be inclusive. So all voices have at the table. That's one. And it has to be on fair and an equal footing. So we need to bring all voices to the table because there are people who have different opinions. It's not like DC where you have like an overwhelming support for DC becoming a state. In Puerto Rico, it's much more divided, you know. So we say two things. It has to be an inclusive process, considering that there's been 123 years of colonialism. You have to have something that's thorough and thoughtful and fair and transparent, you know. So it has to be inclusive. It has to be a process that people can stand by at the end. And we have to know upfront with any status, whether it's statehood or independence or free association or whatever status that is not colonial, what's coming with it and what isn't. If it's statehood, is Spanish going to be able to be used in schools and government transactions? If it's independence, there's going to be reparations for 123 years of colonialism. So we are saying that Puerto Ricans need all of that information up front. Is the law that I told you about, the Jones Act, with all the shipping regulations, is that still going to be imposed under independence or statehood or what have you? What are taxes going to look like? So we need to really be clear. And from a history of oppressed peoples and you know, unfortunately, U.S. history, we've seen many times where there's been a bait and switch, whether it's been from Indian country being this big and then being whittled down to this small, whether it's been 40 acres and a mule, whether it's a bunch of stuff. So what we're saying is that in terms of the deliverables, in terms of what's on the table, when Congress and Puerto Ricans negotiate, we need to be clear about what's a part of the process and what is not, so that Puerto Ricans can make an informed choice. Because unfortunately, we can't sign on, you know, no one, you and I would not sign a contract without reading the fine print, right? So we have to be clear. We have to be clear about what is involved so that people can make an informed decision. Like, this is too high stakes to just kind of have like a Twitter survey, you know?
Right, yeah. As we said, there's just so many layers to it. That, you know, and it's great that you can articulate what you're looking for and make the demands for that, right? And move forward, because it's going to take a lot to create this change and turn things around. And because of the injustices that are out there, that's going to be one of the main blocks too, in getting forward. But as I say, we always press forward, right? We just keep pressing forward, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Also, I know that you are big with social justice and Latino issues. What kind of projects are you working on? Is this taking your whole time, Puerto Rico?
This is taking up a lot of oxygen. I mean, throughout my life, I've been involved, and you know, I guess I would put Latino in quotation marks because it's like one and the same, but it's representation has always been important to me. I have spent some time, you know, my early activism was in police accountability. So pushing for like a civilian complaint review board in New York with teeth to prosecute, and bringing a lot of and I'm talking about this before the social media age, like bringing a lot of light to cases that particularly in New York City. But, you know, I've also been an advocate around immigrant issues in different spaces times of my life. So we're in terms of Power for Puerto Rico, we're focused because the magnitude of problems is so big for Puerto Rico. And so it's sometimes it feels very David and Goliath. So there needs to be a full-time effort around Puerto Rico issues from the diaspora side. So it's very involved, but we're very much in solidarity with other movements. The Self-Determination Act that I was talking to you about has 100 groups from Puerto Rico to stateside that are supporting it, including the National Urban League, including Faith in Action, including Black Lives Matter of Greater New York. So, we understand the commonality of challenges and struggles and try to, work together. I also work with the Women's Media Center in terms of increasing the representation of progressive feminist women on TV and in different media platforms. So I worked with them in terms of launching a channel for Latinas to offer their analysis, their essays, their analysis, their stories. So, and then that original content is sent around to editors, to producers, in the hopes that they will tap these women for commentary on their shows and in their op-ed pages. So making sure that Latinas who are progressive and feminists have an opportunity to share their analysis and their insight with the public in different spaces.
Places where they can be heard, right? Because what I think about, I know in terms of just thinking about everything that's going here with Black women, right? And I'm sure it's the same when we talk about what are we looking for? What are we asking for? What are the demands? What do we want you to do? And it gets a little complicated too when we think about all the years and how do we change all of this? So where do we start? What is it that we want? And I'm sure there are those same issues in the Latino community as well. All brown people, right, are having the same issues. And when I look at, I was looking at your involvement in the media and some of the things that you are doing to support Latinos in just getting their word out and being heard and having. I saw that you are on one of the committees. You're a judge for one of the awards, right?
Right. The Aronson Awards, they're awards that come out of Hunter College. So they recognize mostly journalism from independent media. So we want to make sure there's a lot of great independent media, a lot of amazing podcasts, and we want to make sure that those kind of writers and publications are recognized. And sometimes it's like local investigations and stories that are basically brought up from community level, from local levels, et cetera. And then like you have like the big networks that capture that story, So that's one of the things I'm involved with. Also, there's a City Limits magazine, which is a very policy-driven magazine in New York. And they're a great publication, basically very, they're not doing the story of the day. They're doing lengthy pieces and looking at really how policy works in New York City. So it's important to look at not only what the problem is, but what are the forces, the power that's moving, the undercurrents of power that are moving, so that we understand really how to get to the fundamental challenges, So I think it's kind of like the way the conversation around policing has moved to one around reform, to saying like this whole thing needs to be redone because the way it was imagined to begin with was fundamentally flawed. So I really that's the approach that I find compelling, going to the root of the issue, and I think that's kind of where we're all being pushed, fortunately, and that's why I'm really hardened by the conversations that are happening around white supremacy, around misogyny. And I also look forward to breaking more of a conversation around colonialism, because that's like a system that we haven't been naming, but that the U.S. is very much a part of.
Yeah, it's so much. As I shift to talk about spirituality after all of this and everything that you're doing, right? We generally here talk about spirituality from a practical perspective and how spirituality can support us. And with everything you're doing, it would be quite interesting, right, to hear how spirituality is played out for you. Can you give us a little synopsis of your spiritual journey?
Yes, thank you. And thanks for inviting that question. I really appreciate it. I think one of my challenges with activism and social justice work is feeling like that has always been a long challenge. And I think folks can identify with it, is feeling like I'm not doing enough and feeling like things are so daunting. And I remember someone saying to me, a mentor of mine saying to me, that part of oppression is making you feel like you really can't crack it, you know? And I think it's important to realize that I think what I try to, and it's not like I don't float into that line of thinking, but I think what I try to ground myself in is that I'm playing my role, I'm living my purpose, and that I'm operating in a continuum of generations and ancestors. Like, I'm taking the baton and trying to like move things forward towards like us evolving towards a more just society. So understanding that like that we're all like a constellation of people who are trying to kind of pull back the veil and look at truth for the sake of elevating humanity. So understanding that that's like the driving force, and also that that a lot of people are in the same space as well, you know, so I don't have to feel like, oh, I can never do enough, you know. So, you know, that's a struggle, but also being grounded. And for me, the place that I have come to, I was raised Catholic. I went to parochial school from K-9. And, you know, when I got into college, I really, I sort of like rejected organized religion and really, but what I did find compelling was liberation theology. So, you know, the idea, and it's, to me, it's actually, it's still something that I find compelling, because when I'm not a theologian, but, you know, I did take enough of religion to have an understanding of Jesus. And to me, Jesus has always been an activist. You know, he called out the establishment. He called out the Pharisees. You know, he was a person of love, but also of action, and he spoke out for the most marginalized in society. So to me, it's more about putting love into action. Spirituality is about putting love into action. It's about understanding your connection to others, and your power in that connection. And also that it's not about dogma. It's as I once heard years ago, and it's always stayed for me, and I can't remember who said it, but it was on a TV program that I saw. It's more about the deed than the creed. So I have people in my life, dear friends that are Christian, that are Hindu, that are Muslim, that are Yoruba. And I've seen some of the tensions in my family over people who are very dogmatic about their faith. And then I see it become sort of like, sometimes it feels cultish, and because it feels like separating, mental. And I think also people have to understand that there are belief systems that are, for example, monotheistic, that existed long before Christianity and Islam and Judaism, you know, and those need to be respected. We can't have a hierarchy of belief systems. And we look at how that also geopolitically happened. You know, there was a lot of like consolidation of power, and whose religion gets frowned on, you know, and whose religion gets upheld is also a question sometimes of patriarchy and power, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I take, for example, I have a cousin who leads a church in the Bronx, and his father was known in the Bronx as being a spiritualist, you know, so this is like the African traditions that came to Puerto Rico and then got meshed with the Catholicism. So you'll see like some of the different symbols used in different ways, or a mixing of the symbols. And he really rejects it, because he thinks it's not like that kind of stuff is not legit. And that I find like painful, because I think that my uncle was a good person, and he had his belief system, and it was culturally Puerto Rican as well. So I think that you know, sometimes people really get very they get very dogmatic about religion, when it really should be about connecting and not judging.
For sure, right? And I see that happens all the time when we talk about religion, from religion perspective, right? People of different religions flocking together and believing that theirs is the best and the right one. right? And that's the way to go. Yeah, so yeah, it is interesting how we're raised a certain way, we study religion, and then we get to figure out how it works for us in our lives. And one thing about spiritual conversations for me is being able to talk about who was Jesus and what does it mean to you and how to express it in a way that it works for you today. Because I say Jesus was the master teacher and the principles, I still follow the principles, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm just like so Christian, right? Quote Christian, right? But I also love Buddhism. I love chanting. Uh,
Yes.
there are parts of Hinduism that I really love, you know. So being able to explore all of that in support of what is spirituality all about anyway for us? It's finding a sense of peace, finding joy, finding our place, supporting us, and feeling that we are living our purpose. And spirituality also supports us when we are traumatized, when we're going through stressful times. We find ourselves using spirituality to support us. And all the different spiritual practices that we have. I talk about the spiritual toolkit because it becomes personal for us because there's so many different spiritual practices out there that we get to choose the ones that can work for us. And I like to emphasize like practical, moment by moment. In what moment can you use some of your spiritual practices? One thing I do know, Erica, at one point, family was very important to you. Talk about the project that you did. Um,
With
the, the,
with the ancestries.
yeah, yeah, you wrote a book or you did.
My family. Well, I mean, in terms of my family, the most recent stuff I've done is genealogical
Oh,
research.
okay. Mm-hmm.
Um, unless there's been a few things. I mean, when you and I met and went through coaching together, there was a project I was looking at in terms of my uncle and his experience in the criminal justice system, and how that was also
Oh,
the
right. Okay, that might have been the project. Yeah, okay, that's what I was.
yes,
Right. Okay.
yeah, and then he was it's a very involved story, but my dad at the time who was visiting him on one occasion ran into a gentleman. They just happened to have a conversation, and it turns out he was a civil rights activist and wrote a letter on my uncle's behalf. And subsequently, my uncle was released a little earlier than his term into a halfway house. So that, I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but it's one of those things where it's interesting to me on as a time that we're having a conversation about the legalization of marijuana and the decriminalization of it, and sort of what happened to my uncle, because it was a first time nonviolent offense. And considering, or from my perspective, and I'm still learning more about it, it seemed to be a heavy sentence at the time. And it was happening at a time where, I mean, it still happens today, where Black and Latino youth were being criminalized. So,
Mhm.
so it's something that I think it's a fascinating story because of the space, because of what was going on then, what's going
Mhm.
on now, and also the fact that it was it was an experience where somebody of another community that saw these issues, he was my father always thought that this gentleman was white, and
Mhm.
he was actually African American. He was just light skinned, and he actually talks about getting shade from other people for being like light, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So it wasn't just that my dad was off base, but it's just one of those things, I think, that that has always influenced me as a New Yorker, as a Puerto Rican. And I think it's very unique for New Yorkers in terms of like being finding commonality with the African American community, because that to me was an experience that was like sort of like a second skin experience to a large degree, growing up in Brooklyn and just kind of having, neighbors and friends and just kind of being alongside, having an understanding of the impact of the civil rights struggle, et cetera. So I, it's a family experience, but it's actually in its historical place in New York City. And just
Was your
seeing.
father in law enforcement?
Yes, my father. Yeah, he's a retired lieutenant. Yeah, so that's like another complex layer, but yeah, I think it's one of many, and it's a discussion we're looking to have about. I think that there's a lot of focus on the tension between communities, but there's not a lot of understanding about the history of solidarity and struggle together. Yeah, and then so I don't know if that's what you were referring to in terms of that's a family project that I'd like to revisit. And then more recently we've done like our genealogy. So that's been interesting because on my dad's side, which clearly has African influence, we were able to find an ancestor who had been enslaved and then comes up in the records as free, or at some point in the 19th century. So that was really fascinating because he also appears to be on a plantation in Puerto Rico where there had been a planned revolt. They were waiting for supplies from Haiti, et cetera. So it was interesting to see that line, and that it was actually, and also how Black Puerto Ricans have been singled out over the ages, So for example, under the Spanish, if you died and you were Black, that was specifically noted on your death certificate versus if you were mulatto or white, So it's been interesting just to kind of see. I mean, we know for obvious reasons on my dad's side that we knew that we had African roots, but it was, it started off that my sister and I 2 years ago had been talking about, we're overdue for doing a trip to Africa, and we wanted to try to pinpoint, if we could possibly, what region in Africa our family came from. And then I hired a genealogist. It was like a complete fluke, or maybe it wasn't a fluke. And then she found that strand. Unfortunately, it's like such a wide, you had it's countries that are now formally countries, because back then, like, they weren't divided off by the Europeans the way that they are with the boundaries. So it's still like a wide area, but nonetheless, it was still fascinating to be able to see that on paper.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I had thought about myself doing all of that, going back and finding all the ancestors, right? Which
yes.
What would you say? I understand too that you are doing some transformational work, right? Are you currently doing any of that?
If that's off of my bio, I just mean in terms of like some of the work that I've done so for example, at the city council, the New York City Council, while I was there, we introduced the first like digital access and transparency plan. It was the first time the council had started using technology for public engagement in a more systematized way. So it included everything from redoing the website so that it was reader friendly and more accessible, to texting for communicating with people, to doing a whole bunch of like digital transparency measures to kind of start closing the gap between government and the public, certainly, like, if we're able to get this bill through, the Self-Determination Act, that's going to be in the Puerto Rico work, that's going to be really transformational or potentially transformational, because we're talking for the first time Puerto Ricans actually leading a process to decide for themselves versus being dictated to. So that would be like pretty historical.
That would be, and I guess that really would support them in getting what they want, as opposed to being dictated to, being at the table and being a part of what's going on. Because I think that's one of the things that I look at now in terms of when we're looking at how Black people can be supported now? What spaces are you putting us in? What conversations are we having? When we talk about inclusion and diversity and the whole new conversation around that and what's going on, what kind of things have you seen? What kind of changes have you seen? And what spaces have you been in that you're seeing support for moving us to the table and getting more things done?
In general, I feel like I was saying earlier, I feel very hardened that the conversation has been redefined. So for many decades, the conversation and media coverage, and it still happens, but it's being called out, has been around the deficiencies in our communities. How, and like, I think it's in the last few years, and thanks to this younger generation that's coming up, where you really, like, I mean, think even like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, to talk about white privilege and white supremacy and to see that on cable news, like that wasn't happening for sure,
Right.
So I'm very hardened in terms of like where there's more of an understanding of what's going on by some of our society. At the same time, in terms of the police violence, it just feels like there's like in gun violence, like there's just it's like I know a lot of things are being unearthed, and it's important for us. I think that what social media has been helpful with doing is really exposing things that were injustices that were going on for a long time. So I think there's definitely, less of people working in silos for sure, and I think seeing what happened on January 6th, where you had this mostly white male crowd try to like overtake the Capitol, like really, like if you didn't get it then, you should have gotten it by then, by what happened, So I think that what happened in the election cycle with Georgia being moved because of Black women, Arizona being moved to the blue because of Latinas, like it really shows the clout of women of color and how we need to be at the front. Not, because the Democratic Party also has to do better. So, understanding that who needs to be in leadership and why, it is because we're going to move our own people. We're going to move our own, so that's important. And, I'm hardened by the power of people understanding how to like create and sustain movements and based on a clarity of knowledge. What is, in terms of what I call Gilead from Handmaid's Tale, the people who want to keep women down, who want to dictate choice, who have an issue with people of color, who see people of color and as being a threat, to whiteness and to power more. Because that's what whiteness is about. It's about power and domination, the way it's constructed. So that's like, obviously, that's been a centuries old problem. So that's going to take time,
So we've just gone through a whole year of COVID, right? So what has been some of the impacts on you and your projects and the things that you've done over the past year, and where are you now that we're rolling out of this? Hopefully rolling out, right?
Yes. I mean, last year, it affected me personally because I've lost 2 family members and possibly a third. We're not sure if it was COVID. And it was early on, but so it had that emotional, it still has that emotional impact. And like everyone else, this kind of like new way that we have to live to protect ourselves and protect others, So, but also, this understanding, I think that a lot of people have reached about what matters and what matters less. I hope that people have been introspective. I certainly have. I think that, again, when we talk about structural issues and we see the impact of COVID in Black and Latino communities and the disproportionate impact, of course it was going to be disproportionate because the health systems are disproportionate because, hierarchy, how treatment functions. So again, like there will be another pandemic at some point. So how do we force the changes so that, we don't have, waves of our people dying, because of systemic neglect that predated COVID hitting. I think last year, as you know, and it was everyone, a lot of people, I was very focused on whatever I could do to make sure Trump was not reelected. So I spent, even with COVID, I spent time in Pennsylvania, knocking on doors, talking to people. And I said, so I really felt like a lot of stuff was on hold for me because I felt like I cannot see this man in office for 4 more years. So let me put my time and energy, especially in the last months, in terms of making sure that people don't sleep and get out to register and to vote and not get mired in little squabbles, et cetera, and understand that, they may not be 100% on the Biden bandwagon, but, looking at the alternative and looking at the intent of this man, and I believe that he does have, I don't agree with all of his policy positions, but I do think that he has empathy, and obviously we know that empathy is not enough. Like, we have to change systems and structures, so that has to be the follow through to empathy. It's like what Reverend Bernice King says, that kindness and justice are not the same things,
Right.
So we need to be very mindful of that. But yeah, that was, COVID and the pandemic in a nutshell. And I think in crisis, you see a lot of sometimes the good and the bad come out in people. And it's like, how do you maintain the good beyond the crisis?
Yeah.
What's the positive that came out of here, out of this, that we can kind of sustain the creativity, how do we focus more on family,
the connections, right? Exactly. A lot. That was true. When we do, I always say, we can look at the devastation, we could look at how hard it was, but also take a moment to look at, well, what were some of the good things that came out of it, and we got to take a break. We got to stop for a moment and reassess and really look at what's important to us, connected with family. So there's a lot of pain on one side, but there was also some good things that came out of it. And as we talk about all of that, can you share what would be your top 3 spiritual practices? Because when we leave the show, I'm always talking about the spiritual toolkit and what's in your spiritual toolkit. What spiritual practices do you have? Can you give us your top 3 spiritual practices?
Yes, yoga, definitely, which I've been doing for a while, meditating, and I do Reiki from time to time, and then I also have like these set of cards from, let me see if I can hold them up, from Louise Hayes. So, and you just pull out one card every day and meditate on it. So I try to also like just try, I mean, there's a lot, I can name more than 3, and I'm not saying that I'm like this high level, highly evolved spiritual person that's like Zen all the time, because I come in and out, but like also being aware of it, like what Eckhart Tolle talks about, like being the silent observer, being the silent, non-judgmental observer of your thoughts. So we can have this thread that keeps going and going and rehashing stuff from the past, or like future casting. So, sometimes I get enmeshed in that and all these things I need to do, and then I try to catch it and then look at what's not useful. So, like, why am I still rehashing that issue from back then, and understanding that, like, that's the way the ego mind works, that part of us. So, but without like chastising myself, so kind of like, why am I going there again? Why am I not like, why am I taking 2 steps back? Because you have to take 2 steps, sometimes a step back to go forward. So awareness, I would say practicing awareness, yoga, definitely. I do very frequently. And then just trying to put myself in a space, like, I think it's easy to let work take over and the urgency of work, and understanding that it's always going to be there. There's always going to be a task. There's always going to be a deadline, and understanding that I can pause to call a friend or text a friend, or, spend time with family, or read something, or just take a walk and like just look at nature and etc. So just the stillness, I guess, just the stillness and connection. Just, and
Yeah,
being
it sounds like, yeah, you do have a lot of them, right? Practices.
Yeah, and bringing and having grace and space, doing things joyously. Like sometimes I get into like, looking at work as a chore, and I'm like, wait, I chose this work. I actually literally on the way back from Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, I told a colleague of mine, I said, I want to be able to do something about this. So I spoke it. I said it out loud. And then 4 months later, we were wrapping up our term at the city council. So I had to have started looking for a job. And the hurricane response just kind of like took away my time from doing that search that I wanted to do. But I knew that I wanted to do something in terms of Puerto Rico on a long-term basis. And I had been doing stuff, and I've always done stuff in for social justice, Puerto Rican community, around women. So I spoke it out loud. So I said, so why am I complaining now about things that I have to do are related? And there may be things that I don't like administrative stuff, but it's like, it's all for a reason. It's all to further this work and cause. So just kind of, doing, what I'm talking about, just doing those shifts. Like how do I look at this differently, not out of convenience or rationalizing, but understanding it in a more significant way.
Yeah, and that shift is really, really important, right? To keep you going, right? And keep you doing what you're doing. And I like the part about watching your thoughts and the thoughts that you keep, and how, the idea of thoughts create. And sometimes we could just go and not really watching what thoughts we're keeping and what we're doing, and just taking that moment. I like you. It's like you take the moment to be with nature, just taking the moment. And that's why I like the whole idea of having those moments, being able to stop and have a moment. And it might be a quick prayer, or a breathing moment, or a moment to just pull back. And I think it really supports us a lot when we can recognize and take those moments. So I talk about spirituality from that point of view. How does it support us? And how can we just use it in our lives and not get caught up in as we talked about earlier, the whole part about religion. But what is it? How does the religion support us? And how can we use those practices in our everyday life? So I'm excited that you were able to come and share with us. What would you like to leave us with, Erica? And how can we find you and support what you're doing?
Well, I would like to, my ask would be for allyship with the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act. That is the bill that was introduced by AOC and Nydia Velasquez. And as one of the many co-sponsors is Representative Ayanna Pressley. And as she said last week, this is a matter of justice. So that, and then the other thing is to just be kind to yourself.
Right. That is so beautiful. Yes, that is what we need to do. Absolutely. I love that. Be kind to yourself. And I talk about self-love and how we treat ourselves. And if you're kind to yourself, you will surely be kind to others. Because as we know, is who you're being it's the type of people that you attract into your life. So treating yourself kindly, you'll attract kind people, right? So I
Right.
really appreciate you coming on the show tonight, Erica, and thank you for
Appreciate
sharing.
you.
Very, very informative. A lot that I didn't know. So I really appreciate understanding more about what's really going on in Puerto Rico and what the issues are and the things that you're working on. And I will support you in any way that I can. And I will check you out for dinner soon, right?
Yes. Yes. Thank
Yes.
you for having this platform, for having this space, and I appreciate you always.
Yeah. All right. I'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody, for joining me tonight on Conversations with Reverend G. And I'm here every Monday night bringing you guests from all walks of life, from different perspectives. And we talk about what's happening in the world today and how we are relating to what's happening today and how spirituality can support us as we live this life. And as my goal is to support you in having joy and living your best life with grace and ease, I am sure and I am convinced that having spiritual practices will really, really support you in living your best life. I am Reverend Grenetta Mason, and I'm here every Monday night from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. You can find me on Facebook as Rev Grenetta Mason, on YouTube as Reverend Grenetta Mason, and on Instagram as Rev Grenetta. And I'd like to leave you with a mindful moment. And in that mindful moment, think about loving yourself and taking care of yourself and being kind to yourself. It's Reverend G, and I'll see you next week on Conversations with Reverend G. Have a great, great week.